Good evening. The government has made a major move against organized crime. A federal grand jury has charged 15 men with skimming profits from casinos in Las Vegas and distributing the money to organized crime interests. It's been described as one of the most far-reaching indictments ever handed down by a grand jury, and the men named are described by federal agents as the who's who of organized crime in the Midwest.
This is Kenneth Walker in Washington. Government officials call today's indictment their biggest case in recent years against high-level organized crime activities.
The Justice Department today indeed announced a string of organized crime indictments. Indictments allegedly linking Midwest mobsters in several cities to hidden and illegal interest in Las Vegas casinos.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. Joining me today to talk about the Las Vegas Skim is a distinguished all-star panel, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. He's a former Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective. His extensive experience on organized crime includes his book, Leaving Vegas, the true story of how the FBI wiretaps ended mob domination of Las Vegas casinos, and his documentary, Gangland Wire, that includes actual wiretap audio of the Las Vegas Skim investigation. He's the host of the Gangland Wire podcast. Please welcome Gary Jenkins. Gary, how are you?
Great, Tommy. Thanks for having me on.
Next, he's an author, an expert on organized crime, and the vice president of exhibits and programs at the Mob Museum, the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement. Please welcome Geoff Schumacher. Geoff, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Tommy.
And next, a veteran print broadcast reporter who had been a political editor at the Las Vegas Sun. He runs the Las Vegas Mafia and Mob Summit Facebook groups. Please welcome Larry Henry. Larry, how are you?
Good, Tommy. Thanks for having me on.
Gentlemen, I've always wanted to do a show with a panel, and I could not think of a better topic to do so than this one right here. The movie Casino embellished accounts of Vegas history, the mafia, and the skim. And some of my listeners are going to be detailed and understand the background of the Las Vegas Skim and the entire Skim, while other listeners, this is going to be brand new to them. So I want to explain the Skim, which is when casinos would take an amount from what they made off the top and not report it. They would only report the remaining amount. The money that was skimmed was put into a bag or a suitcase and sent to the Kansas City mob bosses. They split it up and sent money to Chicago, who would then give Milwaukee their share, and Kansas City or Chicago took care of Cleveland. The money was subject to taxes by the Nevada State Gaming Commissions. The other ways that they would skim money is that they would rig scales to show a lighter weight than what was actually on the scale. And Geoff, I want to start with you because you guys have a skim room at the Mob Museum. And if you would talk about that for when people would visit the museum.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the skim was the reason the mob was in Las Vegas. You know, that's the reason they took an interest here. Otherwise, they would have kept doing what they were doing in New York and Chicago and Kansas City and everywhere else. Why travel? So they saw this opportunity, and it really started probably in the 1950s, possibly as early as the 40s. We don't have a lot of evidence to say for sure when skimming sort of was invented, if you will, in the Las Vegas casinos. But we know it was happening in the 50s, and we know it was happening in the 60s. This is long before Kansas City even got involved. And the room that you're talking about at the museum it's kind of an offshoot of our Las Vegas space, and it focuses on the different skimming operations that were uncovered at places like the Stardust Hotel, the Tropicana, the Aladdin, the Riviera, and other places where the mob had infiltrated the casinos in one fashion or another.
Gary, are you familiar, or Larry, or even Geoff, have you heard about stage robberies after the money was put into armored vehicles? You know, the mafia ran those casinos, then they would hold them up and rob themselves to write off the losses and pocket the cash. Are any of you guys familiar with this?
I've not heard of that before. That's interesting. I had not heard that story before.
Going back to the bootlegging days, you know, they would take one another down and rob from one another. I think, the thievery ran deep. And keep in mind, as Jeff said, there were a lot of pockets throughout the country that were really active with illegal casinos. And a lot of those people ended up in Las Vegas. And so skimming was even pervasive in those days, Tommy. And I'm sure that what you're talking about occurred, for instance, in northern Kentucky, across the river from Cincinnati, Newport and Covington, very big illegal gaming area before Las Vegas got up and running. Hot Springs, Arkansas, illegal casinos, Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Carlos Marcello from down in New Orleans, they were all in Hot Springs, Ben Siegel. And a lot of those people migrated to Las Vegas, not only the ability to run casinos, but also to manage the Skim. I'm sure some of that sort of thievery among thieves occurred even well before Las Vegas got up and running.
Well, and if I could add something too, now that I think about it, Larry referenced prohibition, and what rival bootleggers would do is hijack each other's bootleg shipments, right? So they were definitely in competition. I can't say of a specific case, but when you think about the individuals who were known to have sort of transported the Skim from Las Vegas to these other cities, it was cash, right? And they had to carry it on trains or in airplanes or in cars. And they tried to be incognito. And when you think about it, their primary goal was to avoid law enforcement, but also to avoid people who might want to take this money away from them, right? So if you're carrying $50,000 or $100,000 in a satchel or a bag, you don't want to let people know about that because they could take it from you.
The Skim was actually uncovered from a murder investigation in Kansas City. Gary, if you would you talk about to our listeners about who Nick Civella was in Kansas City and how this whole murder investigation in this war kind of started and unblanketed the Skim?
Nick Civella was old school mafioso. His father came from Sicily. He came up through the ranks before the war, and during the war, he got crossways with some guys in Kansas City, and he was robbing protected games, they tell me. And he laid low in Chicago for a while, and then he came back. But when he came back as an heir apparent. It must have been some kind of a deal with Chicago because they've always been kind of like our big brother. He comes back in the early 50s. He's the heir apparent. And by 1957, the old bosses died of natural causes. I think the last one was Tony Gizzo when Nick had been his driver. And Nick Civella appears with an old school prohibition mobster named Joe Filardo from Kansas City at a train station just outside of Appalachian, New York, on their way to the meeting at Barbara's house and Barbera's house. So that's, he was going to be introduced as the man in Kansas City is our understanding. So that's his history. And he has a brother, Cork Civella, and he has a nephew, Tony Civella. It's a little bit older. And those three guys really comprised the Civella family, and they brought in their brother-in-law, Tuffy DeLuna, and he was the underboss during these years. And as we get into the Skim, and then there was about 10 or 12 made guys and a bunch of associates, of course. They had a social club, just like any big-time, big city mob would have, the Northview Social Club or Columbus Park Social Club. And there were some young Turks, shall we call them, and they were all brothers. You had the Civella brothers, Cork and Nick, and you had the Spero brothers, and they were led by their oldest brother, Nick Spero, who was a gangster. He was just a dyed-in-the-wool gangster, but everybody liked him in that kind of subculture of professional criminals. And I don't think he was ever a made guy, but he did a lot of really high-end good robberies. They used to fly out of Kansas City, go to a grocery store in another city back in the 60s and rob the store on payday because, grocery stores back in those days, everybody cashed their check on Fridays and Saturdays. And so there was a pretty good score to be made. And he was doing things like that. He got a good job, union job at a truck dock because he was a mob associate. But Nick Civella started kind of taken a dislike to him, as my understanding, mainly because he was a rebel. He made this statement once to an FBI agent. He said, FBI just said, well, why don't you, join the clique, so to speak? And he said, he said, I'm not joining those guys. He said, they use you up. You're just like a jock strap to them. They use you and stretch until you got no more stretch with you. So he never really joined, shall we say, the club. So he ended up dead. He grew long hair and a beard, and Nick Civella didn't like that. They started calling him in wiretaps. They heard things like he was a hippie, and nobody trusted him anymore. And he ends up dead in the trunk of his car. Well, he's got a younger brother, Carl Spero, who is a dyed-in-the-wool gangster, just like his older brother. He's just younger. He's in jail in Kansas in penitentiary on a jewelry robbery that he had done, or a jewelry robbery, and he got caught. He got popped and ripping off a warehouse full of suits one time during this same time. Anyhow, he's in the penitentiary while his brother's killed and buried. He gets out a few months later. When he comes out, he's on the warpath. He starts recruiting young guys, kind of mob associates, wannabes, people, professional, just whole professional criminal class that you would see, say, in the Goodfellas. And they're going out and doing big scores, traveling around the country, doing diamond shop or jewelry store robberies and robbing grocery stores and other kinds of crimes like that, hitting warehouses in the area and getting, a truckload of suits or a truckload of watches or things like that. So he's recruiting among these guys saying, hey, we're going to move in on Civella's getting everything. He's taking everything. And then we get nothing. So he got a few guys in, and, Civella, if I can find out about it, which I did back then, Nick Civella can find out about it too. So they know the war's on. So we have a bombing of the Trap, kind of a message, the Trap, the social club, the Columbus Park Social Club or Northview Social Club, a bombing there, kind of a message. Then one of us, a Spero associate, is kidnapped and tortured, and they find his body in the trunk of the car in the airport. Classic Bob signature hit. And he had some signs of torture on him. His contents of his stomach were still frozen when they did the autopsy. And so now Nick Civella knows a lot about Carl Spero's plans and knows that they're coming after him and coming after his brother and coming after their underboss, Tuffy DeLuna. So the war's on, and the Bureau's frantically trying to figure out who's doing what. We're seeing on the streets, we're seeing people stalking each other. You see them like driving around and around. You see Carl Spero in a joint. You see Tuffy DeLuna just driving around the block, or Joe Agosto. And you'll see maybe up by Spero or Civella's house, you'll see one of those Speros drive by. So they're stalking each other, trying to get a pattern on the other party so they can set them up for a hit. So everybody knows what's going on. Bureau puts a microphone in a little tavern, a kind of a pizza joint tavern real close to what we call Little Italy, just a few blocks away. And that microphone yields like conversation that they weren't expecting. They expected to hear him talk about going after the Speros, expected to talk about, who could do what and what kind of cars other people were driving, trying to pick up some stuff, some conversation that will help support a conspiracy. And if somebody does get hit, then they've got her, maybe even pick up some kind of plans that it's going to go down and we can be there, because we're out following the Speros and the Civellas, different people from their crew all the time. And what they hear is like, $25 million and the Teamsters Union and Lefty, and are we in on that with them? And you remember that time when you were out there in Las Vegas when Jay Brown cashed a check at Stardust, and so all these different little tidbits about casinos, the Stardust particularly, and Jay Brown, who was a lawyer for, I think he was Harry Reid's law partner, maybe, or a friend of his, who was a lawyer for the Alan Glick, I believe, that Argent Corporation, and different things like that. So, and the Teamsters. So the Bureau knew the Teamsters had been, floating loans to finance these casinos. And when they said, are we in on that with them? Like, hey, we got to find out more. The last words Tuffy said, and I'll finish with this. This is how it got started. The Skim was uncovered. Tuffy said, I got to find a phone. Well, there was a payphone right there. But they, you didn't want to use a payphone in a known mob joint. Any kind of phone in a known mob joint like that, in a bookie place, they take sports bets. And these guys were in there every Saturday night, every Friday night, and 2 or 3 other nights during the week. And they always sat at the same table. That's why they had the microphone back there, because they knew where they would sit. Tuffy says, I gotta find a phone. So we go on a, full court press on Tuffy DeLuna, and we find the phone. It's in a hotel over in the East Bottoms. Get on that bank of payphones at this hotel that he was using, and he starts talking to Joe Agosto, who's working at the Tropicana, and sending Skim back from the Tropicana, not from the Stardust, not from any Argent Corporation hotel, the Hacienda, the Fremont, or can't remember the other one. Marina, yeah. And they've got this own separate Skim going from the Tropicana, but Joe is reporting on Lefty Rosenthal and all his antics. So that's how it gets started. That's when more wiretaps go up. The wiretaps go up in Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland and Las Vegas and more in Kansas City. So that was the genesis of the Skim investigation.
4,000 plus hours of electronic surveillance over 5 states. There's also a 112-page document, also known as the Marlo Tapes. A bug was placed in the home that was in full view of 3 Civella houses. And the meeting takes place on November 28th, 1978. And all this information starts to come in. In June of 78, 50 FBI agents hit Las Vegas with 83 search warrants. From all these tapes, the court authorized recordings of conversations, and you guys, Gary, started to find out that they're using code names. Genius was being referred to Alan Glick, who was forced out of the Argent Corporation that controlled the Stardust, the Fremont, Hacienda, and they also had 65% of the Marina, which opened in 1975. There was a code 22 for Joey Dove's Iupa, and there was all these code names. How long did it take to start figuring out who was who with all these code names?
Let me add something real quickly, and you hit on it. And to me, it's one of the most significant mob locations in the country. You've got the Raven Idol, Mulberry in New York. Clearly, a lot of significant, mafia places that the building still exists. But I think the Marlo House in Kansas City, and Gary's got this on his Gangland Wire side. Jeff, the museum has a display that gets into this too. I think the Marlo House in Kansas City, bugged, surveillance audio in place. Carl Thomas, who was at that time, a respected gaming executive in Las Vegas, and you mentioned Joe Agosto, and Gary mentioned Agosto, who ran an entertainment show at the Trop. They went to the Marlo House in Kansas City, as you said, Josephine Marlo was a relative of the Civellas, and Gary and Jeff can speak to this better than I can, but in that house, Carl Thomas and Joe Agosto laid out for the Civella crime family's hierarchy how the Skim works in Las Vegas. Carl Thomas later said he regretted it, died at the age of 60, single vehicle wreck. He got a plea deal because he snitched off some people who were involved in the Skim. But to me, that what Gary talked about, the Villa Capri, the pizza place, and then what happened at the Marlo House. And Jeff and Gary, as I say, can respond to this better than I can, but those were so significant in uncovering what happened, how the Skim actually worked in Las Vegas.
Yeah, maybe I'll let Gary wrap this up, but I will add, Carl Thomas at the time was regarded as a legitimate casino operator in Las Vegas. He was really, really smart, and he was, hobnobbed with all the, sort of regular folks in Las Vegas, only to come to find out that he had been the mastermind of skimming operations for years. And this preceded, this preceded the Tropicana, that he had been involved in skimming. And he was close with Ross Miller and Ross Miller's wife. Ross Miller was the father of Bob Miller, who became the governor of Nevada. But Thomas is just absolutely outlining in explicit, clear detail, right? Exactly how this played out. You can't have a better wiretap recording or bug in existence that I know of. Am I right, Gary?
Oh, you're right on that one. Plus, the sound quality was good too. For sometimes the sound quality on those things, they had to hustle up and get them in. They only had a short period of time, and this place was hard to get in. This was it, going into the Devil's Den here up in what we call Philomena Acres. And they did it. They did. They pulled a couple of subterfuges that were pretty slick, and they did it. And the tapes are just, they're clear, crystal clear. He says stuff like, talk about Carl Thomas. Goes back earlier in his earlier days. He said, yeah, I remember when I was at Circus. He said, we had a number to meet. He said, and I'm just taking money, just hand over fist. And Bybee, who was a gaming control officer who was real famous at the time, said, Bybee, just stand there and watch me. And Nick Civella said, yeah, sometimes when you steal right in front of somebody, it's the best way to do it. So, I mean, it was dynamite.
Bragging about it.
Yeah. It was unbelievable. He said, you go in the count room. He said, just take hundreds, just count, boom, 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 and, walk away. Nobody knows. You just tip off the guy out in front, and he doesn't know what's going on. And you got my guys inside the count room. So it was unbelievable.
Carl Thomas started at Circus and then went to the Stardust and ended up at the Tropicana. He testified that he gave expertise to skim money from all three. Circus at the time was under Jay Sarno. And he even stated that the skimming began there in 1969 when he was asked by Alan Dorfman, who was tied to the Chicago outfit. You guys mentioned his charges were dropped for his cooperation, but he did serve a 15-year prison term imposed for the 1983 of the skimming of the Tropicana. And I want to go back to, Larry, kind of where we got off a little bit, because I want to bring my listeners up to speed that these tapes just weren't saying, hey, this is Carl Thomas, this is Alan Glick. They had these code names. And how long did it take to start figuring out who was who?
And you hit it perfectly. With somebody like Thomas, as Jeff said, highly respected member of the community. A lot of this was going on, and I could be wrong about this, but I think Thomas even went back to what was the Bingo Palace, then Palace Station, I think. So he was even deeper than just Circus and the Trop. But think back to, it wasn't new what happened in the 70s with the Trop and the Stardust, the Argent Corp casinos. That became highly publicized. There was a lot more money in Las Vegas by the 70s. So in the movie Casino 2, that really brought that to the forefront. But it goes way back. I mean, when you look at, so even before the Fremont was owned by, and I know I'm a little bit off topic, but I want to sort of take it back a step. It wasn't just that skimming was sort of uncovered, in the 70s. Back even before the Fremont was owned by the Argent Corp, there was a courier named Ida Devine, who was from Hot Springs, Arkansas. A lot of people moved out from Hot Springs to Las Vegas because they understood how the casinos and the skim worked. She would take the skim from the Fremont downtown to the train station where the plaza is now. It became the Union Plaza, Jeff, 70, 71, something like that. But before then, she was taking the skim back to South Florida to Meyer Lansky. Even before that, in the 50s, around the time of the Korean War, 53, 54, Ed Reed, one of the authors of the Greenfeld Jungle, worked for the Las Vegas Sun, where Jeff and I worked for. Well, not with Reed. We were there later, but Reed worked at the Sun, and he walked into the Desert Inn at one point. And I think it was after midnight. He goes into the Desert Inn where Las Vegas is now. He sees all the big mob, 10, 12 big mob higher-ups, mainly from the West Coast. This is pre-Spilotro, pre-Lefty Rosenthal. These were the old school mobsters, some from the East Coast too. He sees the sheriff. They're all sitting around yakking at the craps tables, guy named Glenn Jones. So some of the goons take Reed out front and beat him up. But so mob control of casinos in Las Vegas and the skim predates Frank Rosenthal and everything that happened with the Argent Corp, which blew up with the Marlo House and what happened at the Villa Capri. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in. So it took years, sort of a shorter answer of your question. It took a long time really for the crackdown to occur and to really start putting people in the black book, arresting people, getting in the mid 80s, as Jeff and Gary referenced. That's when the trials occurred in Kansas City that really imprisoned a lot of Midwestern mob bosses from Chicago Milwaukee and Kansas City. So for a long time, investigations occurred, and then a lot of heavy trial dates and convictions occurred in the mid-'80s.
Jeff, I want to go to you here next because, and you can pick that up with Larry too, but I want to go, we guys talked about Joe Agosto a little bit. He was a main info, basically a middle guy. Can you speak to what his issue was with Frank Lefty Rosenthal? And for our listeners, Rosenthal served as an executive consultant for 3 casinos, but what was Agosto's problem with Rosenthal?
Well, so first of all, Joe Agosto is an interesting player because he kind of came out of nowhere. He was a very unusual mob figure in that he sort of just, he came out, I think had issues, he was involved in criminal activities in Alaska, I think, and in different places around the country. And he kind of just arrives at the Tropicana, and now he's installed with the Kansas City mob, helping them out with the Skim. And but he had criminal convictions, so he was not allowed to get a gaming license. But he then became the executive producer of the Folies Bergère show at the Tropicana, the premier stage production in Las Vegas. Joe Agosto didn't know how to sing. He didn't know anything about singing. He didn't know anything about dancing. All he knew about showgirls is what we all know about, which is that they're beautiful or whatever. That was the extent of his knowledge of it. But he was the executive producer of Folies Bergère. That was just a front for him to, manage the Skim there. Interestingly, it was the same scheme at the Stardust, right? Lefty Rosenthal was having trouble with gaming authorities, and so he was the entertainment director, and he was the food and beverage manager, and all kinds of things at the Stardust. But I think the problem, Joe Agosto, first of all, he might have just had a personal issue with Lefty Rosenthal. He probably didn't like each other. But beyond that, Lefty was a guy who, he's an enigma, but he really was had a very public profile here. And when you think about whenever a mob person gets a high profile, you think of Al Capone or John Gotti, the first thing people want to do is take him down, right? Law enforcement's like, well, this guy, is almost flaunting his ability to be a criminal in plain sight. And so I think Agosto was complaining to the bosses in Kansas City that Lefty was out of control, that he was hurting the operation. And Gary can add to this, but I think that was his main complaint, is that it was creating too high of a profile for what they were doing.
And the main thing that they were worried about, and Joe was worried about, and Nick Civella was really worried about this, is that Joe was working, as you said, as the executive director of the Folies Bergère. But see, these guys, they have felony convictions. They can't get what they call a key person license. You have to have a key person license to do anything around the money or the gaming floor or anything. Even if you're just selling, I think if you just have drinks or the bartender or something on the gaming floor, you have to have a special license with an extra heavy duty background check. And these guys couldn't have that kind of license. They weren't even supposed to be pushing a broom in the casino for the most part. But they slipped in under this entertainment director for Lefty, a director of food and beverage and entertainment, the Folies Bergère. So Joe was really concerned, and so was Nick, that he was bringing so much heat down on himself, fighting. The gaming control board was trying to kick him out of the casino, totally out. And he was fighting it, and he changed job titles for a while. Filed a lawsuit against him and won that, or at least got it overturned, and they were moving on him again at the last. And Joe was so worried that then they would start looking at him after they see what the scheme is, and now they'll start looking at him, and he would get kicked out of the Tropicana. That was their big problem. They talked about that several times. Plus, the bringing the heat down, law enforcement heat. Nick Civella knows. Nick Civella, the kind of guy that if you didn't pay attention to him, you wouldn't even know he existed for the most part. No flamboyant car, no flamboyant activity, never even went out to the joints at night, didn't want his guys doing things like that. And here Lefty is in the newspapers all the time, and Agosto's reporting that back. So Nick, he actually called him. I got the transcript. We don't have the tape. And he called him and he said, you got to cool it, man. Just cool it. You cannot keep fighting these guys. And then he reports back to Lefty or Tuffy DeLuna, and he said, he said, well, it was really colorful. He said something about Lefty or Crazy. They called him Craze or Crazy. He said, Crazy, he's like an animal out here that he's wounded, and the coyotes are starting after him, and they're going to keep picking at him till he's gone. And, there was all those reasons were the reasons that they wanted to get Lefty out of there or get him to shut up.
For those who don't, for those who aren't well versed in this, to the extent of what Lefty was doing, he started his own television show. And it was like a Johnny Carson kind of Tonight Show kind of show. And he was the host of the show. And then he would have on different celebrities. He would have comedians and actors, and Frank Sinatra appeared on the show, and it was on local television, and it was horribly produced. It was not good, but he was Lefty Rosenthal. He could do what he wanted, and I could just imagine Nick Civella being just appalled by this whole notion of having a mobster having his own TV show.
I'll even go a step farther, listeners. I'll put a link in the show notes to one of the Frank Rosenthal show that was filmed at the old Jubilee here in Las Vegas. And you can see just how poor production of a show it is, but I'll put it out there. It's completely in its entirety. You can watch the Frank Rosenthal show on there as well. Gentlemen, does anybody know if Civella or DeLuna or Agosto, was there ever any talk about taking Rosenthal out with a hit?
No, nothing direct in any of the wiretaps I got my hands on that went into court. They were just frantically trying to get him to quiet down.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick even called Oscar Goodman and talked to Oscar Goodman about him and said, hey, what do you think the deal is with this guy? Because he's frantically trying to he didn't want to kill him. He just wants him to shut up, just go away. And so I don't think there was any. I think maybe, somebody did try to kill him after it all came down. And, my personal opinion is it was Kansas City, because by then they would have known he's the only one that didn't get indicted. He's the only one that didn't have to go to the grand jury. He just walks away clean, and he's right in the center of this whole thing. All of a sudden, everybody forgot who Lefty Rosenthal was. And, it doesn't take a genius to figure out he was some kind of a deep throat informant. As it turns out, he was a top echelon informant. But during that time, again, that just draws heat. Nick does not want to draw heat. That would just draw heat to kill him in the middle of all this.
Gary, after all this investigation, it was time to take it down, or at least start the process of taking it down. Can you speak to my listeners about the notes that Tuffy DeLuna kept and how detailed they were?
Well, that's one for the ages right now, I think. I never forget. My assignment that night, what they did, we hit about 10 houses in Kansas City. And my assignment, all like the guys in the intelligence unit, we put on our police uniform, got a marked car, and went along with the agents who were going to knock on the door and then go in and serve the search warrants, because there was a mob war still going on between the Speros and the Civellas. And so we didn't want any mix up on who was who on this deal, because we'd already had some kind of brushes with this. And so I went into Tuffy's house, and he was very cordial. And I'll never forget the FBI agent's name was Shea Airy. He's since deceased. He was kind of an old school agent. And he's searching around. He knows Tuffy pretty well. And Tuffy finally says, Shea, he said, why don't you go down to my office downstairs? That's where the good stuff is. So they go down to his office. They know they're going to get to it anyhow. And they get down there and they start pulling these papers out. And nobody really knew what it was at the time. But when they got it back, and Bill Owsley, who was a case agent on this thing, they got it back. He had been monitoring all the transcripts, the wiretaps. His mind was filled with all the detail. And they get it back, and they see these notes and these dates and these code names, like they figured out by now who Glick is. You mentioned about how do you figure out these code names from these wiretaps? Well, you just like start putting it in context, and they're talking about this guy here. And then you call out the FBI, out to the Las Vegas, and you talk to them about, they describe this guy who could that be? You know, you just have to start putting it together from the different contexts and different people. They're looking at these notes, and they've got like Glick, or they got Genius, and they've got these dates, and they've got this, like $180 out, $180 back, parking $15 on a certain date, and things that detailed. I even had the list of where the Skim was going out of Kansas City. We deduced. It's got about 10 guys on it who are all the old school guys that you would probably assume were made, and they all got anywhere 5% or 10%. And then the rancher, who was Roy Lee Williams, the Teamsters boss here, had 1,500 next to his name. And they deduced from that was $1,500 a month for Roy Lee Williams, and those other percentages were what each of these different made guys got. Even guys that weren't really directly involved with the Skim, he was sharing with all of his made guys. And so that's, the notes, I mean, their trips to Chicago, and we're on there, and trips back out to Las Vegas, and you just couldn't believe the detail, which were then supported by the wiretaps.
Was there any figures that, and you guys know, there would probably never know the exact amount that was skimmed, but is there anything close? Is it 10 million, 15 million, 4 million? Does anybody know a number?
There's only one number that anybody can really say, I think, unless somebody did a forensic audit of these casinos back then, is when that night that we served the search warrant, Valentine's Day, Carl Caruso, who had a legitimate junket business going back and forth to Las Vegas, he was a courier, and he came back and he had 2 months Skim from the Tropicana, and he had $80,000 on him. So $40,000 a month from the Trop only, not the other four. This was only the Trop. See, Nick, he set that up on his own, and he actually, out of the goodness of his heart or his wisdom, sent 5 figures periodically up to Joe Agosto personally.
I was thinking about what you asked about when the Skim ended. It wasn't just uncovering what all these mobsters were doing in places like Kansas City, Chicago, the Trop, the Stardust, and all that. Jeff Schumacher has written the definitive book. It's a must-read on Howard Hughes. And Jeff also hosted a mob museum event from the Hughes House near Channel 8 in Las Vegas. But when Hughes came in the late 60s and began to buy up properties, and then also in the late 60s, the Nevada legislature allowed corporations, publicly held companies, to begin buying casinos. Before then, each person had to be licensed. So a publicly traded company, Walmart, McDonald's, whatever, has thousands and thousands of quote owners because they own stock. But you couldn't do a background check and license everybody who owned stock in MGM or Caesars or whatever. So that also changed the landscape of Las Vegas and pushed the mob out. They couldn't compete. A 150-room mob-run hotel couldn't compete with a 5,000-room modern Las Vegas property. So over time, Steve Wynn built the Mirage in '89, started a boom of mega resorts. So over time, I think you could assert that with those events, the Howard Hughes event, nobody in the country can speak better to Hughes than Jeff. But over time, with the way Las Vegas changed regarding who owned casinos and who could have secret ownership of casinos, corporations aren't going to allow that. That also, everybody always asks, is the mob still in Las Vegas? There's organized crime all over the place of different, nationalities and groups and so forth. But that also dramatically changed the landscape of Las Vegas and elbowed the mob out. There's no way they could have competed with a modern corporation's casino.
Larry's absolutely right about that. I want to just go back to Tuffy DeLuna for just 20 seconds. I do a lot of talks about the mob to different groups, and inevitably I find myself saying, when people ask me questions about how much money or this and that, and I'll say, well, one of the problems we have in the history of the mob is the mob didn't keep notes. They didn't keep records. Right? That was the thing that they didn't do, right? You don't do that. And Tuffy DeLuna, it was the one exception, man. He kept meticulous notes. And I think, Gary, am I right, that the reason he did that is he never wanted to be accused of abusing his privilege, right?
Right. He did not want anybody to think he was cheating on anybody.
Right. But those notes are legendary. And by the way, we got to find a way to get those original notes into the Mob Museum display. We'll talk about that later.
I agree.
We'll talk about that later. I know.
Are they in the court? They have to be in the court record somewhere. Gary, by the way, Gary is mentioned in Nicholas Pileggi's book, Casino, which became, the movie. Gary's in that book. Gary's mentioned that book as the guy who found those notes.
Yeah.
I wasn't the guy that actually found them, but I think
where are those notes, Gary? Are they still in the court record somewhere?
But see, there's just a few that they put in as evidence in the court records. I got copies of three of them, because I went in the court file. But Bill Owsley's got all of them. He snagged onto all of them.
He has copies, right? He has copies.
Yeah, he has copies. I don't know.
I want to get that original notebook.
Okay.
We're gonna get that from the FBI, probably.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know where it is. That's a good question.
Guys, there were 2 trials under one investigation called Operation Strawman. The Tropicana in 1983 and Argentcorp in 1985. 83 indictments of 15 men, including some names we haven't brought up yet. Anthony Chiavola, his son Anthony Jr., both of Chicago. Carl Civella, Peter Tamburello of Kansas City, and we haven't brought him up yet as well. Some witnesses became informants. Jimmy Fratiano, Ken Ito, and Joe Agosto, and Angelo Lombardo all become informants. The Chicago boss, Joey Aiuppa, was secretly controlling the Stardust and Fremont casinos with the Teamsters pension money in the 70s. He was convicted by a federal jury in Kansas City. Before I go into some other people and bring them up that were convicted, I want to backtrack a little bit. I'll go to you, Gary. Can you tell us about Peter Tamburello? Because his name's very rarely brought up with the Las Vegas Skim.
Pete Tamburello was Nick Civella's driver and had been for quite a while. Funny little story. Nick had a colostomy bag late in his life, and we used to call Pete his bag man. Pete lived down the street from Nick, and it was his constant companion. But I don't think they didn't really have those conversations like he had with Tuffy. Tuffy was an underboss, but probably could be called a consigliere also, because he really went to Tuffy with his problems, and Tuffy gave him advice, and they discussed things. Pete didn't really sit in on those conversations. He was around somewhere, but he was just kind of always on the edges. I don't even know, we never really paid much attention to Pete. He was just always there. He goes all the way back in Kansas City. They've known him all his life. He did help he took a hit for helping bribe the warden of the penitentiary, a federal prison down in Texas, trying to get Tony Spilotro, Nick's nephew, transferred at least up to Leavenworth to be closer to home. And they picked him up on a wiretap talking about that. And I believe he took a conviction on that. But the rest of it, he just seemed to stay. They kept him kind of away from it, actually taking any part.
Some of those that were convicted, I said Joey Aiuppa, he was 78 years old. Milton Rockman was 73. Those guys of Cleveland. John Cerrone, 71 of Chicago. Angelo LaPietra was 65 out of Chicago. Joey Lombardo was 57 at the time, each convicted on 8 counts, and each count carried a maximum of 5 years and a $10,000 fine for a possible total of 40 years and $80,000. 4 others pled guilty. Kansas City boss Carlos Civella and the Milwaukee boss, who we haven't brought up yet, is Frank Ballesteri, and his sons Joseph Ballesteri and John both won dismissal after the government presented evidence. Tony Spilotro was involved in this, but he was to be tried later, as was Carl Tuffy DeLuna, as he was severed from the trial for reasons ordered kept under seal until the verdicts were returned. I want to go to Tony Spilotro. Why Tony Spilotro was to be tried later? Let's start there.
Well, I would guess it has a lot to do with Oscar Goodman. And Oscar was his attorney. Oscar was a very good attorney. He also got Nick Civella severed from the first case into a separate case. And Oscar was that was kind of a talent of his somehow. He was able to break his clients out to have their own cases. And in the case of Tony Spilotro, in the end, he was killed right before he was ever convicted of any kind of skimming related offense.
And then, Gary, for you, do you know what the reasons were that Tuffy DeLuna was severed from the trial?
I don't. I didn't really realize that. So I'll have to look into that. I didn't really realize that. And if they kept it under seal, I'll find out.
Gary is on it.
Well, and a lot of that's legal maneuvering. It's like Jeff said. Jeff, didn't Oscar have Jimmy Chagra severed from some of that? So I think a lot of that is just, Tommy, a lot of that's legal maneuvering. They don't want their client to be lumped in with other bad guys who they think certainly are going to go down. So I think that's what some of that is. And again, these are all full stops in undoing the skim in Las Vegas. What you're talking about, Tommy, with all those Midwestern mob bosses. And as Jeff said, a couple of years later, after all those convictions, Tony Spilotro and his brother were beaten to death in a house near O'Hare Airport in Chicago and buried in an Indiana cornfield. So it really began to unravel with those trials, with the death of the Spilotros. About a decade after that, a guy named Herbie Blitzstein, who had been Tony Spilotro's right-hand man, basically, at a jewelry store that Spilotro ran, and was fencing a lot of stolen goods and all that. Blitzstein was killed in the mid-'90s. So it all those trials you're talking about, Tommy, is really a part of what caused all the unraveling of the skim and the mob era in Las Vegas.
The jury deliberated for 30 hours over 6 days. One of the speakers that's been at the Mob Museum was U.S. Strike Force prosecutor and the chief of the Justice Department of Organized Crime, David Helfrey, said guilty of 5 mob figures proved beyond a doubt that concerted workings of Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Kansas City crime families and their hold on the Las Vegas casinos and the Teamsters. Judge Joseph E. Stevens Jr. did not even allow the word mafia to be named in the testimony. Some of the key government witnesses where I want to go next was Alan Glick, Argent Corporation owner. He said he was intimidated into fronting the mob. The state of Nevada forced Glick to give up his casino license. He testified he did not know there were mob ties of Frank Ballesteri. But although Alan Glick went to school with one of his sons, Joe, I don't know what kind of friends they were. I don't know if they were even close associates or not. Who Alan was and how he was intimidated.
Well, I don't know. Alan Glick was he was kind of like Lefty Rosenthal. He was magic. He just walked through this whole thing unscathed and made a lot of money when he sold the casino, the 4 casinos, is my understanding. But he was a kind of a small-time entrepreneur out there, and I think he got the connection to Ballesteri to another Teamster that he had met somewhere, and got a Teamsters tried to get a smaller Teamsters loan to do some kind of development. Teamsters pension fund had got onto this. They could make more money from making these loans and going into the stock market. So they were investing their members' money in these loans and using the interest and getting the money paid back too. And they, the loans, they were paying the loans back. They weren't just taking the money, stealing it. They were paying the loans back. And he got that, but then he was told by somebody that if you want to get a big Teamsters loan, you need to go to Milwaukee and see this man, Frank Ballesteri. Now, his story is that, so he, calls up there and gets an appointment with this Mr. Ballesteri, and Ballesteri says, I think we can do a deal. It's kind of a funny thing. It's a weird thing. He had Glick, I don't know how he explained this because I know it's in the evidence. He had Glick sign an agreement that if he left the casino, he would then sell it to Ballesteri for like $50,000 or some, just small amount. I don't know how they ever explained that one, but because the government were willing to trade his testimony, they didn't question anything more about our friend Mr. Glick. They needed his testimony, and he buried him. He buried Nick Civella like you can't believe. Of course, Nick died before he actually went to trial, but he buried him. He was, and Tuffy DeLuna, he buried both of them. As he testified that one evening, Lefty Rosenthal came to him and said, we got to go to Kansas City and meet this man. And Alan Glick says, oh, well, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'll go. I mean, go figure. And they buy this. So they have a private jet. They fly to Kansas City to take them to the Marriott Hotel. And he describes all this, the Marriott Hotel on the airport grounds. It's really there. Says he's ushered into a room. They're met by Tuffy DeLuna. They go to the hotel. They're ushered into a room, and there's a man in there, and there's only one light, a lamp. And he said he's instructed to sit in this chair with the lamp shining in his face, and just outside of the glow of the light from the lamp in the dark is another man who they say is Nick Civella. And Nick Civella says, if it's up to me, you never leave this room alive, and you owe me $1 million. And Glick says, well, I don't know. I can never pay that. I don't know what you're talking about. He says, you don't worry about it. You don't have to pay it back. You've got a man working for you. This guy right here, some words to that effect, he can take care of that. So what they were trying to do is intimidate Glick into getting into line and not standing in the way of the Skim coming out of his casino. So that's, and they, for that kind of testimony, you can let a guy walk. I think he didn't have a record of any kind, didn't have any prior history. So they let him walk for that kind of testimony and other testimony. He testified, he buried Tuffy DeLuna. He claims that he testified that he was told to go to Oscar Goodman's office. When he gets there, there's a man he's told is Carl Tuffy DeLuna. Tuffy DeLuna picks up a piece of paper and reads off the name of his wife and his kids. And he said, we want you to sell this casino and you got to get out. Or, you say, maybe you don't have anything to lose, and names off his wife and kids. These people have something to lose. Comes on back. Now that was verified in some manner in the first microphone interception at the Villa Capri. Tuffy is overheard to say, I told him, I said, boy, you'd make whatever kind of effing notice you have to make and get out. And so that was verification of that story. So, but that's the kind of my take on Alan Glick.
One of the sort of unfortunate things, at least from a historian standpoint, is that Alan Glick really took besides his testimony, he really took his story to the grave. He, as far as we know, he never wrote anything down. He never wrote a book. He never did a podcast. He never did a documentary or anything where because he could have really provided a lot of context and a lot of information that we don't have if he had come forward in more later, but he never did. And, maybe the mob appreciates that he didn't come forward, but, that was one of those unfortunate things. We kept waiting.
Larry, did the FBI allege that Glick hired a private attorney in D.C. to gather information into federal agents and the grand jury investigation? What can you speak about on that?
It was all, I don't know specifically about that. Maybe Gary and Jeff do, but the bottom line on all of that gets back to what Gary was just talking about. There was enormous pressure. People like Nicholas Pileggi would say that Glick got into it, as Pileggi said, like a frog into a boiling pot. When the water began to heat up, he really tried to get out. He got over his head. Now, prior to him getting involved in Las Vegas, he allegedly, real estate agent in San Diego, real estate developer, was involved in some land deals that may or may not have been shady. There was some issues about whether, somebody who was later killed in San Diego named Tamara Rand was mixed up in some financial deals with him, all this other stuff. So he was always involved in legal kerfuffles. So, yeah, anything that he may have done to hire attorneys to look into people and all that stuff, I can imagine that was going on because he was, as Gary said, you're not, when you get on a plane with Lefty Rosenthal, fly to Kansas City, Nick Civella says you're not going to leave this room alive unless you become our puppet. And then Tuffy DeLuna with his feet on Oscar Goodman's desk, as we know who your kids are. You're going to do anything you can to take these guys down. And he did, as Gary said, testify.
Here's another important name that I think, for me, it's the aha when you bring up Alan Dorfman, the insurance agency owner and consultant to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. He was a close associate of Jimmy Hoffa, associated with the Chicago outfit, and he's murdered. How does Alan Dorfman play into this skim?
Dorfman controlled the purse strings. He didn't singly control the Teamsters pension fund. And I think we're looking at this through our modern eyes with all the knowledge we've got. Transport yourself back to 1970. The Teamsters pension fund is loaning money to businesses. The Teamsters pension fund is loaning money to people who want to start a casino so they can make money. Everybody's making money. The Teamsters pension fund was like the golden goose laying golden eggs. And Alan Dorfman, longtime Chicago outfit associate, his dad had been an associate, a Teamster, and involved with the outfit. And because the Teamsters in Chicago and the Chicago outfit, they were like, hand in glove, shall we say. So Alan Dorfman is, the man. And then they find other people on that pension fund board. But Alan Dorfman, he's the big duck on that board. He has invested money for them. The Teamsters listen to his advice. They know to take his advice because the mob won't like it if they don't take his advice. Kansas City, Nick Civella's got a guy on the Teamsters board that is a local guy, Roy Lee Williams. He owns him. They got Cleveland's got Jackie Presser. And Milwaukee's got a guy named Frank Rainey who's actually on the board. So they combine these guys. But Alan Dorfman was a big duck in that. And everybody knew him. But back then, nobody knew who he was for the most part.
The through line of this whole conversation that is the Teamsters, right? And when you're talking, the Teamsters started loaning money for Las Vegas casinos in the late 50s. And it continued through the mid 70s. And the mob, as Larry mentioned earlier, the mob didn't have the kind of cash that people think they do, right? If you're going to build a multi-million-dollar casino, you need some help. And the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund was that help. That was that boost that the mob needed to build this foothold in Las Vegas. And even later, of course, it all ended in the late 70s, but that hundreds of millions of dollars were loaned to mob-connected businesses to build Las Vegas.
In mind, too, how volatile era was. Why was Dorfman killed? I mean, a former FBI agent who was a lawmaker in Nevada, his car was blown up, allegedly in some sort of spat over control of the land that the Horseshoe sat on. Potentially by a hitman named Tom Hanley, who later was convicted of killing the Culinary Union secretary-treasurer, a guy named Al Bramlett. As Gary mentioned, Frank Rosenthal's car was blown up. It was a violent, volatile era, and people were taken out who were suspected of being potential snitches. Johnny Roselli was killed. Alan Dorfman was killed. There was a lot of Jimmy Hoffa, as Jeff mentioned, really controlled a lot of the Teamsters' money and how it was doled out with casino construction in Las Vegas and more. A lot of people were killed during that era who potentially would have been snitches, who potentially could have hurt those mobsters. Reporters were attacked. Ned Day, who was a legendary mob-busting reporter in Las Vegas, Valley Times, the RJ, Channel 8, really aggressively went after the mob. His car was firebombed. He wasn't in it. Jeff Gehrman, a friend of ours, all of ours. Jeff was at the Sands one time at an event. Reporter Jeff Gehrman was a reporter for the Sun and the Review Journal. Jeff was at an event at the Sands, and a mob associate comes up to him. Jeff had aggressively reported on this person. His windshield had been knocked out in his car, stuff like that. This mob associate comes up and hits Jeff in the mouth. Now, Jeff last year was later killed by somebody allegedly that he had written about, but this was back in the mob era. So I guess the point I'm making on why was Dorfman killed and all that stuff, it was just a real violent era. It wasn't just, like I say, Tom Hanley. It wasn't just, mobsters. It was a violent era, and the way of eliminating people who may have snitched on you was to take them out.
Former Teamsters president Roy Williams, that we've brought up a couple times, was the first person in such a position to testify he took orders and was paid by mafia boss Nick Civella, who was the head of Kansas City. He died in 1983 after being released from prison. What was the impact of Roy Williams' testimony?
I can tell you that you mentioned earlier Helfrey speaking at the museum a couple years ago, and he was the lead attorney on these Strawman cases. And I don't know if you could have a better case. And Gary played a role in creating these cases. But I mean, they had everything lined up to convict these guys, and they were brilliantly executed prosecutions, and that Williams plays into that.
Gary, do you know the impact of his?
It was, I'm sure it was devastating. I don't remember specifically. I know the case agent on this, a guy named Bill Owsley, still around today, got a couple books out there. Maybe wants to really good Kansas City mob books. Look up Bill Owsley. And he's the one that debriefed Roy Lee Williams, and he told an interesting story and filled them in on all the little details that they didn't know before. Like verified that he was getting that $1,500 a month from Nick Civella and a lot of other things. It's funny story is they met, Williams told Bill all this, they met Civella and Roy Lee Williams in the 50s. Both of them were sitting on a Democratic Party nominating commission for Jackson County, which is our county here in the city. They were deciding who the party would support, running for state legislature or running for some county job or something like that. So, and Nick had always been tight with him, except one time. And you remember the story about Alan Glick and having the light shine in his eyes? Well, Roy Williams told Bill exactly the same story that had happened to him from Nick Civella 20 years or 30 years before. He said Nick Civella had a plan for the Teamsters around here to buy some kind of it would only cost them $2 or $3 each to buy some kind of a crappy kind of a dental program or something. And Roy Williams told Nick, said, well, that my guys aren't getting anything for their money. So then he was sent for, sat him down, put a light in his eyes, and so was told, hey, you guys need to go for this program. So that's one reason I would believe Glick. But he knew, from the Kansas City end, all the ins and out of how they intimidated the Teamsters and what a Teamster boss like that could do for him.
Was part of the mob, and just part of the mob's downfall, the fact that they thought and acted like they owned Las Vegas?
I think so. I think I want to mention, Larry mentioned kind of a very important part of this, which was the corporate investment in Las Vegas with Howard Hughes kind of opening that door, and then the legislative changes that allowed corporations to move into Las Vegas. I think that's very important. I think an also very important element was the election of Michael Callahan as governor of Nevada. And I'm working on a book on this, but Michael Callahan came in 1971, and he hired a bunch of young Turks for the State Gaming Control Board in Nevada and said, I want you guys to go after the mob. Now that was new. I mean, that was essentially a new concept. We had grandfathered in so many of these mob guys in the 50s and 60s and said, well, we got to leave Modalitz alone. We've got to leave these different folks alone because they're safe, they're good for the community kind of thing. And Michael Callahan came in with a fresh voice and said, no, we're gonna knock these guys out. And he brought in, all kinds of really smart people, Dennis Gomes and people who are on the board of the Mob Museum today, and Harry Reid. And he said, we want you guys to really push the mob out. And so the State Game Control Board had played a big role in that. They uncovered the slot machine skimming at the Stardust, and they just took a totally different attitude about it. And I think that was a big part of the downfall, because Las Vegas kind of said, you know what, to the mob, like, hey, thanks for building our city. Now get the hell out.
Yeah, and definitely. And I don't think you can overstate the importance of media pressure, even in the tapes Gary talked about. Civella and those guys were mentioning the Las Vegas Sun and the Review Journal. I think you have to really point to people like Ned Day, George Knapp, Jane Ann Morrison, Jeff Garriman, people who work for Jeff Schumacher, Chris Crystal, Myron Borders. There were some really, and I'm unintentionally leaving some names out so we can move forward, but there was really aggressive Bob Stoddall, who is a significant person at the Mob Museum. There was an enormous amount of media pressure. And Mike O'Callahan, whom Jeff mentioned, became the executive editor of Las Vegas Sun, Hank Greenspun. There was an enormous amount of pressure from the media that became a national story because of aggressive reporting by reporters in Las Vegas. And I think that also played a significant role in pressuring the mob in Las Vegas because they were arrogant. From television shows to running around to places like Jubilation, high-profile guys. And I think the media pressure played a big role in that, too, as one more factor in the things that brought down the mob.
Larry, I have to add one more. I think it's kind of a three-legged stool, really, what happened in the 70s. There was a state gaming control board gets serious. There was media exposure. And then it was also in the late 70s, the FBI brings a whole new crop of individuals and strike force attorneys to go after the mob. Even the FBI had been lackadaisical in Las Vegas about the mob. And in the late 70s, that changed as well.
If you guys want more info into the Las Vegas Skim, go to the show notes. I'm going to put a link to Gary Jenkins's book, to his documentary, Gangland Wire. You can get more in depth into that. There's actual wiretap audio in the documentary, and I believe also in the Kindle version of the book, right, Gary?
Correct. That was, I used a bunch of transcripts and I linked them all to an actual audio.
Great book, Leaving Vegas.
Go to the show notes and you guys can get linked up and check out all these things. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time coming on and talking about the Las Vegas Skim. I appreciate all three of you very much.
Thanks, Tommy.
Thanks for having us.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. I want to do a special thank you to our guest, Gary Jenkins, Jeff Schumacher, and Larry Henry. Do me a favor and take 30 seconds, rate and review the show. Give me 5 stars. Nice comments are always appreciated. Until next time, everybody, I'm Tommy Canale. A salute, a chin chin.